Good morning, everybody. Right now, out in the tropical Pacific Ocean, a climate event is building that scientists are describing as potentially the strongest ever measured in the modern instrumental record. And the reason that should genuinely concern you isn't just about hotter summers or wilder storms. It's because we've actually seen an event like this before, nearly a century and a half ago, and when it happened, it triggered what climate researchers now call arguably the worst environmental disaster to ever befall humanity. A catastrophe so severe it killed somewhere between 30 and 60 million people across 3 continents in the span of just a few years. That event has largely vanished from public memory, overshadowed by the world wars and other disasters of the 20th century, but scientists studying it today are drawing a direct, unsettling line between what happened in the late 1870s and what's currently developing in the Pacific Ocean right now. And here's the part that should really get your attention. Several of the leading researchers tracking this new event are saying, in plain, direct language, that the world in 2026 may actually be less prepared to absorb a shock like this than people assume, because this El Niño isn't arriving into a stable, cool climate, the way every previous major event in the historical record did. It's arriving on top of a planet that's already running hotter than at any point in recorded human history. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what happened during history's deadliest climate-driven famine, how scientists finally proved what actually caused it, why this year's event is being compared directly to it, and what the honest, evidence-based answer is to the question of whether this one really could turn out worse. No exaggeration, just what the historical record and the current science actually show. If you've never heard of the Great Famine of the 1870s before today, drop a comment and let me know, because I think that's going to say a lot about how far this story fell out of public memory, despite how enormous it actually was. Let's start with the historical disaster itself, because you cannot understand why scientists are so alarmed about 2026 without first understanding exactly what happened in 1876. In the years leading up to that event, the tropical Pacific Ocean had been sitting in an unusually prolonged cool phase, the longest cold stretch in the entire climate record up to that point, running from roughly 1870 through 1876. Climate scientists studying this period now believe that extended cool stretch allowed an enormous reservoir of warm water to quietly build up and accumulate in the western Pacific, essentially loading a spring under mounting tension for the better part of 6 years. In 1875 and 1876, that tension released as a powerful La Nina, which triggered dry conditions across India, Mexico, and the southwestern United States. But that La Nina was only the warning tremor. What followed immediately afterward was the main event, all of that pent-up warm water discharging explosively eastward across the Pacific in late 1876, launching what researchers now believe was the most extreme El Niño ever identified in the historical climate record, an event so severe that scientists studying tree rings across Asia found evidence of the worst drought conditions in at least 800 years. What made the 1877 to 1878 event even more catastrophic than a typical El Niño was that it wasn't acting alone. Researchers have since discovered it was supercharged by 2 additional ocean anomalies happening at exactly the same time. The Indian Ocean experienced an unusually intense positive phase of what's called the Indian Ocean Dipole, with the western half of that ocean basin running dramatically warmer than the eastern half, a thermal contrast that in 1877 was the strongest ever recorded before or since. That dipole event compounded the drought-inducing effects of the El Niño itself, particularly across India and East Africa, essentially stacking 2 separate climate anomalies directly on top of each other at precisely the worst possible moment. The consequences unfolded across 3 separate continents almost simultaneously, and the scale of each individual disaster is genuinely difficult to comprehend, even in isolation. In India, an intense drought triggered crop failures across the Deccan Plateau, and what followed became known as the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878. Historical demographic analysis has placed the death toll from that single famine somewhere between 5.6 and 9.6 million people, with a careful modern demographic reconstruction settling on a figure of roughly 8.2 million deaths. And it's critical to understand that this wasn't simply a natural disaster playing out without human interference. Even as the famine deepened, the colonial government continued exporting record volumes of grain out of the country, with the viceroy at the time overseeing the export of more than 6 million hundredweight of wheat to England while millions of his own subjects starved. Relief efforts that were provided came in the form of what was grimly known as the temple wage, a punishing daily ration of roughly 450 grams of grain paid in exchange for hard manual labor performed without shade or rest, a system explicitly designed to be harsh enough to discourage all but the most desperate from seeking help. The human toll was magnified not just by the drought itself, but by the political and economic decisions made in response to it, a pattern that climate historians studying this event keep returning to, As a critical lesson, the weather created the crisis, but human systems determined how many people actually died from it. At almost exactly the same time, on the opposite side of the planet, an eerily similar catastrophe was unfolding across northern China. The Northern Chinese famine, which ran from 1876 through 1879, killed somewhere between 9.5 and 13 million people, concentrated most heavily in Shaanxi province, which alone lost an estimated 5.5 million people, close to half its entire population once famine-driven migration is factored in alongside direct deaths. Neighboring provinces suffered almost as catastrophically, with roughly 2.5 million deaths in what's now Hebei province, 1 million more in Henan, and another 500,000 in Shandong. Local communities initially tried to respond with traditional relief measures, soup kitchens, free grain distribution, emergency shelters organized by community leaders and wealthier households. But as the drought stretched on year after year without breaking, those local systems were completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what was unfolding. And on the other side of the world entirely, in northeastern Brazil, the same El Niño-driven drought produced what became known as the Grande Seca, the Great Drought, which killed an estimated 500,000 people in that region alone, according to some historical estimates, with other analyses placing Brazilian fatalities as high as 2 million. 3 separate famines on 3 separate continents, driven by the same single climate anomaly playing out simultaneously across completely different societies, different governments, and different economic systems, and yet producing catastrophic mass mortality in every single one of them at nearly the same time. When you add up the confirmed and estimated death tolls across India, China, Brazil, and additional affected regions, including Egypt, Morocco, Ethiopia, Southern Africa, Colombia, and Venezuela, researchers studying this event place the total global death toll somewhere between 30 and 60 million people, with the most commonly cited figure from peer-reviewed climate science research, settling at more than 50 million. To put that number in a frame of reference that actually captures its scale, that's a death toll comparable to both world wars combined and to the 1918 influenza pandemic, all condensed into roughly 3 years, and largely driven by a single ocean temperature anomaly most of the affected populations had absolutely no way of understanding or predicting at the time. Researchers who've studied this disaster in depth have described it in stark terms, calling it arguably the worst environmental disaster to ever befall humanity, and noting that no deadlier environmental catastrophe has occurred since, not nearly 150 years. For a long time, historians debated exactly what had caused this global catastrophe, with some 19th century scientific papers even proposing weakened sunspot activity as the underlying trigger for the Indian drought specifically, a theory that was eventually discredited. It wasn't until modern climate science developed the tools to properly reconstruct historical sea surface temperatures and cross-reference them against tree ring drought records spanning centuries that researchers were finally able to confirm what had actually happened, an intense, prolonged El Niño event, compounded by that record-breaking Indian Ocean dipole, had simultaneously disrupted rainfall patterns across enormous swaths of the tropics and subtropics at the exact same time. And human societies dependent on those rain patterns for their food supply simply had nowhere to turn when the rain didn't come. So why does any of this ancient history matter for a video about the year 2026? Because right now, in the Pacific Ocean, scientists are watching a shockingly similar sequence of events unfold, and they're not being subtle about drawing the comparison. NOAA's Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory ran its seasonal prediction model 30 separate times this past July, using slightly different starting conditions for each run to capture a range of possible outcomes. And in a result that forecasters describe as genuinely rare, every single one of those 30 simulations projected a peak El Niño strength competitive with the most powerful events ever recorded in the last century and a half. That kind of unanimous agreement across an entire ensemble of independent model runs is one of the strongest technical indicators of forecast confidence that exists in modern meteorology, and it's now pointing toward an 81% probability that this El Niño reaches a genuinely record-shattering peak. Sea surface temperature anomalies are being forecast to climb past 4 degrees above normal at their peak, a threshold that formally qualifies this as a Super El Niño, placing it in the same category as the historic events of 1982, 1997, and 2015, and by several key measures potentially exceeding all 3 of them. Here's where the comparison to 1877 becomes genuinely important rather than just an interesting historical parallel. Climate scientist Daniel Swain, who studies exactly this kind of extreme climate event, put the core concern about this year's event about as plainly as it can be put, stating directly that we have never experienced a strong or very strong El Niño event arriving amid pre-existing global conditions that were already this warm. Every previous Super El Niño in the modern instrumental record, 1982 to 1983, 1997 to 1998, 2015 to 2016, developed on top of a cooler baseline ocean than the one we're sitting on right now. Global average temperatures today are running more than 1.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and current sea surface temperatures are already sitting higher than any single day recorded during the entire 1997 to 1998 Super El Niño, before this new event has even reached its projected peak. When you layer an El Niño of this projected intensity on top of a baseline that's already this warm, two separate physical effects compound each other simultaneously. First, absolute sea surface temperatures reach dramatically higher peaks than an equivalent anomaly would have produced on a cooler ocean decades ago. Second, and this is the part that matters most for the flooding side of the equation, a warmer atmosphere physically holds more moisture, roughly 7% more per degree Celsius of warming, meaning the exact same El Niño-driven rainfall patterns that caused catastrophic flooding in 1997 and 1998 could plausibly produce measurably heavier rainfall and more severe flooding this time around, even from what is nominally a comparable strength event on paper. It's worth being precise here about what the researchers are and are not claiming, because the comparison to a 50 million death global famine deserves genuine care rather than casual sensationalism. Nobody studying this year's El Niño is predicting a repeat of 1877 in terms of raw death toll, and there's a very important reason for that. One of the researchers who studied both events directly addressed it. The countries hit hardest 150 years ago, China, India, and Brazil, are today largely no longer vulnerable to that same scale of acute, famine-level food insecurity, thanks to a century and a half of agricultural modernization, infrastructure development, and vastly improved capacity to move food and aid across long distances quickly. That's a genuinely important, genuinely reassuring difference, and it reflects real human progress that shouldn't be dismissed. But the researchers making that comparison are equally clear that progress doesn't mean the underlying risk has disappeared. It means the risk has shifted to different, more specific vulnerable populations rather than being eliminated altogether. The World Food Programme's own preliminary analysis of this developing event projects that the 2026 to 2027 El Niño could push somewhere in the range of 36 to 49 million additional people into acute food insecurity by the end of 2027, concentrated heavily in regions including the West African Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and Yemen, areas already grappling with conflict, fragile governance, and limited existing food reserves before this climate shock even arrives. For context on just how significant that projected number actually is, the 2015 to 2016 El Niño, itself one of the three strongest events in the modern record, is estimated to have impacted the food security of somewhere between 60 and 100 million people globally when all of its downstream effects are accounted for. The World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization have taken this threat seriously enough to launch a first-of-its-kind joint appeal, requesting more than $200 million specifically to protect nearly 9 million of the most vulnerable people across 22 countries before the worst of this event's impacts actually arrive. A genuinely unusual step to take this far in advance of a climate event's peak. There's also a broader economic dimension to this comparison worth understanding, because these events don't just cost lives, they cost staggering amounts of money that ripple through the global economy for years afterward. The 1997 to 1998 Super El Niño alone, considered the strongest single event in the modern instrumental record before this year, is estimated to have caused global economic losses of $5.7 trillion within just 5 years of its onset, once every downstream effect across agriculture, fisheries, infrastructure damage, and health system strain is fully accounted for. Direct global damage tied to that single event, from flooding, cyclones, droughts, and wildfires, has been separately estimated at somewhere between $32 and $96 billion, and it was linked to approximately 23,000 deaths worldwide, even in a far more economically developed and better prepared world than existed in 1867. If a 2026 event genuinely matches or exceeds that intensity, and current forecasting gives it a real, non-trivial chance of doing exactly that, the economic disruption alone could plausibly rival or exceed anything the modern global economy has experienced from a single climate event. It's also worth understanding the specific mechanisms through which an event like this actually causes harm, because it's easy to think of El Niño purely in terms of one single outcome, like drought, when in reality it reshapes weather patterns across the entire planet simultaneously, and different regions experience completely opposite effects at the very same time. Historically, strong El Niño winters have brought what meteorologists studying the 1982 and 1997 events described as genuinely incredible flood years across the southern United States, as the strengthened southern storm track drags heavy rain from California all the way to the east coast, while simultaneously the northern tier of the country runs warmer and drier than usual. Meanwhile, across the Pacific and Indian Ocean basins, The exact opposite pattern often unfolds, with Southeast Asia, parts of Australia, and southern Africa frequently pushed into severe drought conditions. As the normal rainfall patterns, those regions depend on shift dramatically eastward, out over open ocean, rather than falling on the land where crops actually need it. El Niño also intensifies marine heat waves, and in an ocean that's already been running warmer than normal for years due to background climate change, those additional heat spikes hit coral reefs and coastal ecosystems that are already under significant stress. Past strong El Niño events in 1997 and 2015 were both associated with major global coral bleaching episodes, and a third major bleaching event, triggered by an even stronger anomaly on an even warmer baseline ocean, could inflict damage on reef systems that have not yet fully recovered from the previous two rounds, undermining fisheries and coastal protection for millions of people who depend on those reefs for both food and their livelihoods. There is genuinely one silver lining worth mentioning, honestly, because a fair accounting of this story requires including it. Strong El Niño events tend to increase wind shear across the tropical Atlantic, which historically has had a suppressing effect on Atlantic hurricane activity, potentially reducing the number and intensity of storms threatening the Gulf Coast and the eastern seaboard this season compared to what an equivalent year without El Niño might produce. That's a real meaningful benefit for coastal communities in the Americas, even as those same communities may simultaneously face an elevated flood risk from the strengthened winter storm track moving in from the Pacific side. Perhaps the most important and most sobering point being raised by climate scientists studying this event is one about the fundamental limits of our own forecasting tools. As one prominent climatologist bluntly put it earlier this year, the historical playbooks that meteorologists have relied on for decades, the detailed impact maps built from the 1982 to 1983 event, the flood and drought patterns documented during 1997 to 1998, the temperature records set during 2015 to 2016 were all calibrated against events that unfolded on a meaningfully cooler ocean than the one we have today. Every model being used right now to predict how this year's El Niño will actually play out across specific regions was built and validated using historical data from a climate system that no longer exists. We are, in a very real and technical sense, watching an event unfold in genuinely uncharted territory. And the honest, professionally responsible answer several leading researchers have given when asked directly how confident they are in predicting the specific regional outcomes of this event is that the models have simply never been verified in this particular territory before. That's not scientists being alarmist for the sake of attention. That's a direct, honest acknowledgement of the actual limits of current scientific understanding when facing something that has genuinely never happened before in the era of modern climate monitoring. So where does that leave us with the actual question this video set out to answer? Could this really turn out worse than the disaster that killed up to 60 million people in the 1870s? The honest, calibrated answer is nuanced in exactly the way genuine science tends to be, rather than fitting into a single dramatic headline. In terms of raw global death toll, it's extremely unlikely this event approaches anything close to the scale of 1877, precisely because of the enormous gains in agricultural capacity, food storage, transportation infrastructure, and international humanitarian response systems built over the past century and a half, specifically in the regions that suffered the most catastrophic losses last time. That's genuine, hard-won human progress, and it matters enormously. But in terms of the sheer physical intensity of the underlying climate event itself, the ocean temperature anomalies, the amount of atmospheric moisture involved, the potential for genuinely unprecedented rainfall and flooding in specific regions, several of the leading scientists studying this event are saying, without hedging, that this could plausibly be the most intense El Niño event ever measured, arriving on a planet that is fundamentally hotter and more energetic than at any point since we've had the instruments capable of measuring these things precisely. Whether that translates into a worse outcome than 1877 depends less on the raw meteorology and more on something researchers keep returning to again and again when studying that historical famine: how effectively human systems respond to a climate shock, rather than the shock itself, ultimately determines how many people actually suffer and die from it. That's genuinely the most important lesson buried inside this entire comparison, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we close this out. The 1870s famine wasn't simply a natural disaster that happened to humanity. It was a natural disaster whose death toll was dramatically amplified by specific human decisions: continued grain exports during active starvation, punishing and inadequate relief systems, and a colonial economic structure that prioritized commodity extraction over the survival of the people producing it. The climate event created the crisis. Human choices determined its true scale. As this year's Super El Niño continues developing toward what may be a historically unprecedented peak over the coming months, the aid organizations, already mobilizing, The early warning system's already tracking vulnerable regions, and the international response that gets organized in the weeks and months ahead are going to matter just as much, if not more, than the raw strength of the ocean anomaly itself in determining how this chapter of the story ultimately gets written. What do you think? Had you ever heard of the Great Famine of the 1870s before today? And does knowing that history change how seriously you take the warnings coming out about this year's El Niño? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and I genuinely love to hear whether this is the first time this piece of history has crossed your radar. Because I think that says something important on its own about which disasters get remembered and which ones quietly disappear from public consciousness. If this video helped connect a piece of forgotten history to something genuinely relevant happening right now, hit that like button. It helps this kind of research reach more people who deserve to actually understand the scale of what's developing, rather than just seeing another vague headline about hot weather. And subscribe if you want to keep tracking this story as it develops over the coming months, because this event is still building toward its peak, and there's going to be a great deal more to say about how it actually plays out region by region. Share this with anyone you know who dismisses El Niño as just another weather buzzword, because understanding what happened the last time an event like this reached its full potential is exactly the kind of context that turns a vague warning into something worth actually paying attention to. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.